Hello and welcome to episode 86. It's a pleasure today to be joined, and I've asked for the help with the pronunciation of the name, and it's Mark Athitakis. It's a pleasure to have Mark with us. While I may have trouble with his name, I know his work really well. Who is he? He's a writer, editor, critic, blogger, reporter, essayist, and white-paper-ist, which I want to have him explain in a minute. He's written short and long pieces for publications like the New York Times and Washington Post, published 2 books, one over my right shoulder here, and provided editorial assistance from basic proofreading to deeper guidance on book length projects. He has taught, consulted, and generally helped people tell their stories better. His particular expertise is in association, nonprofit content, and literary criticism, but he delivers professional work in a variety of contexts. Mark, how are you today? Thanks so much for joining me.
I'm doing fine, Peter. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this.
Oh man, it's a pleasure to talk to somebody with such, so much work out there and so many different genres and a multifaceted writer. Can you explain the white-paper-ist?
Yeah, I can. That little bio kind of makes my professional life feel a little bit more orderly
Okay.
than it normally would. So that's sort of like me on LinkedIn. So very, very kind of buttoned down. But I think for me, it's always just been bouncing around doing a lot of different things as a writer and mainly as a journalist. The white paper. The one thing about that bio that is nice is that it's sort of removes the kind of scrim that I've set up sort of online. I kind of lead 2 separate lives professionally, one of which I think is, if you follow me on Twitter or on Facebook and so forth, is as a book critic, as a book reviewer, as somebody who writes about authors, interviews authors. But, I spend pretty close to the other half of my professional writing time writing about nonprofit leadership, nonprofit management, governance, which, I think may put a lot of people to sleep. But I actually really enjoy the people in that community because ultimately they're leading organizations that are trying to improve their professions. They think a lot about how to, lead their staffs better. They do a lot of smart stuff. So the white-paper-ist stuff, speaks to that particular world that I occupy, where people want to put their data and their experiences on best professional display. So that's really what I'm talking about there.
Okay, so I mean, is that like grant writing? Is that part of it?
Not necessarily. It's more oftentimes what a lot of these organizations do is they will conduct research about their particular industry. Let's say that it is. I mean, the joke in the association world is that there's an association for everything. I talk to people who are rodeo clowns, women in trucking, corrosion. There's an association for corrosion. Anything. And so a lot of these organizations will conduct research about what their industry is doing or how their industry is perceived, and what they need done is to have language to kind of wrap around the findings of these studies and surveys. So that's some of the work that I do.
Okay. So if I'm anti-corrosion, is that okay? Are you pro-corrosion? Okay.
I think as somebody who recognizes entropy, I think corrosion is just something we're going to have to live with, right? But if I understand correctly, that the Corrosion Society is responsible for standards towards addressing corrosion and fighting it.
I gotcha. All right. So I don't assume that your first writing was in the field of corrosion. Going back a little bit, what your relationship as a child with literature, with language, with words. Talked about Greek background. I mean, do you speak Greek? Did you speak Greek growing up?
I do not, but growing up, both of my parents were immigrants. They were both from Crete, and as I think a lot of immigrant kids feel, you feel a little bit separate from mainstream American culture. Where mainstream American culture, even for me, I was born in the U.S. and raised in the U.S., but you grow up in an immigrant family, you're raised with a tradition that is very, very different from what you see on TV and that what you see, your friends are experiencing. And I also had a very kind of different, weird relationship with language, just because my parents picked up English in 2 very divergent ways. My father effectively memorized a Greek English dictionary and spent a lot of time like reading the works of Nikos Kazantzakis, like, in Greek and in English. And so he has a tremendous vocabulary, but not the best grammar. But he had, kind of a very sort of, I don't want to say high toned, but sometimes, in some ways, if you are an English learner, you
Yeah, I
learn the
understand.
word that is sort of like semi-adjacent to the right word.
Mhm.
So it was kind of interesting just trying to parse my father's experience with language, whereas my mother watched Romper Room. She watched TV. She
Mm.
listened to the radio. She was a great fan of country songs, and
Oh,
it,
okay.
it was confusing to me a little bit at first because they were kind of both dyed in the wool, grew up in Greek culture, but country songs, everybody is very articulate, everybody is telling a story,
Mhm.
everybody is sharing straightforward sentiments in relatively straightforward ways, but also it's very idiomatic. So
Sure.
both of my parents' experiences, they're sort of yin and yang, because my father was, you could come off as a little bit more intellectual, but not much for casual speaking, whereas my mom, you know just
Uh,
really kind of inhabited the quote unquote American idiom a lot better. But in any event, living with both of them, I wouldn't say that I had like a sophisticated, kind of, theory of this built up when I was 10 years
mhm.
old. But, I was certainly aware that English was a learned thing, and that English had different valences, and that it sounded
Sure.
different depending on who was speaking. So I think that, at an early age, I was made alert to that.
Mm. Very interesting. I'm reminded of in School of Education, I'm a high school teacher. We learned about BICS and CALP,
Okay.
which are acronyms. And I'm totally blanking right now on what they stand for, but the idea is that one is more of the slang, if you will. One is more of the, like the TV, the idiomatic, right? Versus the more intellectual, the more official, I guess you'd say.
Right.
Very
Exactly.
interesting. Okay. Who or what were you reading? Were you into science fiction? Were you into the usual, children's classics? Were you reading, you know, uh, the Three Musketeers when you were 5 years old, like upper level stuff?
I was not a sophisticated reader for a long time. I was, I mean, I was a good reader. I did well in school, but I did not have any real passion for books until I
Mm.
was in high school. I think the one thing I most fondly remember were, do you remember SRA packets? Which
Yes.
were, those sort of, they were kind of like 2-3 page sort of things. You pulled them out of a box in the classroom and you did like a little report about them.
Okay.
So, and they
Okay.
were meant to kind of like, test your comprehension skills. And I realized
Right.
later on, I don't know if you know this, that one of the main writers for those back in the 60s and 70s was Raymond Carver. That was
Whoa.
a
Okay.
sideline for him. So I suppose I could say I was a fan of Raymond Carver when I was in third or
Uh,
fourth grade, but wasn't reading his short stories. But
sure.
no, it wasn't really until high school that I think I got really enchanted with like 1984 and Animal Farm.
Hmm.
And I think also just one of the books that I first got enchanted by, because I discovered it in my high school library, was Nelson Algren's The Neon Wilderness.
Uh-huh.
And I think part of it was, growing up in the Chicago suburbs, um, you know, and growing up in a suburb that was full of a lot of Greeks, Slavs, Poles, and that was who Nelson Algren was writing about. And I think it kind of
Mm.
turned my head sideways. It's like, oh, there's actually a writer who writes about something not unlike the community that I grew up in.
Mhm.
Which was, a little bit surprising. I knew my father had a few books also by Mark Athitakis, who wrote
Okay.
about Greeks on the south side of Chicago as well. So I think that copy of the Neon Wilderness was, to my embarrassment, the first thought that it was. I was just fascinated by the concept. I just, that wasn't in my classroom reading. I was supposed to be reading
Mhm.
Shakespeare or whoever. That the idea that there was somebody who was a little bit. I was naive enough to not realize that. Oh yeah, there are people who write about place.
Mhm.
And so I found that very fascinating. And I think the other book that I discovered when I was a teenager that was really important to me, and I've written about this and tweeted about it numerous times, is Paul Fussel's Class, which is this semi-satirical, came out in the mid 80s. It was kind of a semi-satirical guide to the American class system about how people who are from low pro, which is like, the deepest urban poor, to the elites, the people who like, own, large estates off, in Rhode Island and Newport.
Mhm.
Um, how they talk, how they dress, how they speak, what their life experience is, where they go to school,
Mm.
And it was almost like, going back to that, immigrant experience of feeling like you're not sure about how this weird country works. That was fascinating to me. And it took
Mm,
me a while to realize that, a good chunk of it is written in a very tongue-in-cheek kind of way.
sure, sure.
But for me, it was sort of like, oh, okay, like here's the manual. Here's how
Ah,
American society functions in a lot of ways. So I found that absolutely fascinating.
so that'd be one that you definitely would read differently as you got older,
Oh, absolutely,
right?
absolutely. And
You took a more surface level at the time.
yeah, absolutely. Because I mean,
Uh-huh.
I think when you're at that age, I mean, you're so none of your peers are really going to explain this to you because they're all kind of the same sort of social
Uh-huh.
class. I did not have that experience where I was, seeing kind of high and low, and so I think so many of the things that were kind of confusing to me about class, became a little bit more sensible to me. And I will say that there's one chapter in that book that because if you read this book it kind of implies that you are doomed to your fate. That if you are
Hmm.
sort of middle class, that you will never rise above your station. But there's a chapter in that book that is called The X Way Out. And it doesn't refer to Generation X, though I'm a Generation Xer. It just talks about how people who have more artistic and journalistic sensibilities are people who are able to better escape that fate. They're able to
Mm.
um, possess that kind of class mobility that keeps them from being stuck where they are. And I found that's like, oh, okay, there's the escape hatch. That's what I can do. Because I think he mentioned something explicitly like the people whose bylines readers actively seek out. It's like, oh, okay, if I can become that kind of person, and I don't
Right.
think I have necessarily, but if I could try to, then maybe I can get there and maybe I can kind of find that escape hatch and not necessarily feel like I'm stuck in that low prole status that I was
Sure.
born into.
Oh, that's really cool. I love language. I love how you use the term not unlike earlier. Not the same as like,
Right.
not unlike, right? It's like that approximate sign in math, it's not equal to, it's like approximately, right?
Yes,
Not
exactly.
unlike. Oh, that's awesome. Now I wonder, now Greek as a language, saying that that your parents spoke it. Is there something about Greek in particular, like that particular language, that informs your writing in English?
No, just because I mean I don't want to say flat no because but I think there's I never learned the language. I always say that I knew it well enough to know when my parents were talking about me. Um, but I think that it really more just plays into the fact that hearing different languages in a household is really going to make you maybe a little bit better attuned to English when you
Yeah,
hear it.
right.
So I think maybe the best I could say is that maybe it made me a little bit more attentive to dialect and different kind of sounds,
Uh-huh.
when I started paying attention to that thing. But I wouldn't want to uh, overstate the case there.
Right. As you got older into college and into, more recent years, who are some of the writers, or what are some of the texts that really thrilled you, that resonate with you?
Are we talking about contemporaries or are we?
We can talk, we can talk as contemporary as you want.
Okay.
Maybe some turning points in college around those years, or maybe even more recently.
Well, I mean, Faulkner was certainly a big one.
Mm,
Just because I love the idea of having a writer that I had to try to figure out, had to
yes.
figure out structurally, linguistically. I mean, his language just sounds magnificent,
Hmm.
but he can be very, very difficult. And I think I made, in some ways, kind of the rookie mistake of starting out with like the real high modernist stuff. I don't
Hmm.
think that The Sound and the Fury or even As I Lay Dying is necessarily the best place to start with Faulkner. Probably better to start with the short stories like Barn Burning or to start with Light in August. But I tried to get into all of it. And even if I kind of fell short in understanding a lot of it, I think that was a great experience. I loved Philip Roth when I was in
Mm,
college. Marilyn Robinson is, still an important writer to me who I think inspired me to read differently, think differently
mm.
about the Midwest, about religion, about how you can write about both of those things. But I was thinking about in preparing for this conversation, I was thinking also about, you know, critics who I really admire
Right.
as well. And I think, for me, because I mean, so much of my reading life is kind of very, I don't want to say programmatic, but I make a point to try to read as many kind of current going critics as possible.
Mm,
So, for me, writers like Patricia Lockwood or Perul Segal
okay.
or Leslie Jameson or Laura Miller. I mean, those are sort of, when I think about, when I want to get better at what I do, those
Hmm.
are people who I pay close attention to. There is
Sure.
a writer named Elizabeth Nelson who writes mainly about music. She writes a little bit for the New York Times Magazine
Mm,
recently, but she does a lovely job of writing. She does these tweets about particular albums or about particular songs that are really kind of attempts to kind of a little bit like Robert Christgau to kind of distill an artist's essence in a
hmm.
280 character tweet. And I really, really enjoy what she does in terms of trying to be erudite and kind of completist, but also working in this very, very compressed form on Twitter. I find
Right.
that really kind of interesting and really like engaging with that.
That economy of language, huh?
Yeah, exactly,
Oh,
exactly. Because I mean, I think I am a, I do like writing longer pieces, but I
yeah.
do think kind of my sweet spot is, trying to figure out how to make the shorter review work. So I'm
Mm.
always impressed by anybody who can conduct that act of compression really well.
Right. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but the famous saying about if I would have had more time, I would have made it shorter. You know,
Right, exactly.
and
Yeah.
I always try to pause for dramatic effect with my students. They're thinking, oh, I'm going to say it longer, but no, I said, shorter. Like, yeah, the idea of fewer words, right? Fewer characters. It's tougher to make
Hmm.
your point. The music. I'm sorry. Tell me the name again of the music journalist
Oh,
or
Elizabeth
critic.
Nelson. She's in a band called the Paranoid Style, and her
Oh,
Twitter handle is Paranoiacs.
ah. Now, is when she writes about music, is it necessarily music you like? Like, does that matter, or you more does that throw you off, or you just like, hey, I'm looking at the writing, or like,
Oh, there's definitely a kinship. I mean, it's more like,
mm,
it's kind of, the 70s, 80s, 90s rock alternative,
okay,
alternative rock, indie rock space. But I mean,
uh-huh,
I think, so it's Neil Young, it's Joe Jackson, Elvis Costello,
mm,
that sort of thing. But for me, I mean, I started out my journalism career as a music critic, and I was one of those
ah.
guys who was trying to cover as many waterfronts as humanly possible. So I try not to be too stuck in my
Sure.
middle-aged white bread ways.
That's a good transition. Not the right white bread ways, but the music critic. Some eureka moments or eureka moment where you discover like I'm good at this writing thing, or I love this writing thing, or somebody gave you feedback. When did you kind of get like I can do this and I can do this well?
Well, the good at the writing thing, I feel like I'm still working on
No.
constantly. I feel, well, no, I mean, I know really, and this may go back to Midwesterness when we get around to talking about it. That there's a certain sort of, a
Humility.
built-in humility
Right.
attached to it. I was thinking about this just this morning because somebody had posted about an album by Paul Pena, who was a blues singer who is best known for writing the song Jet Airliner for
Hmm.
the Steve Miller Band. And his career
Ah.
in itself kind of stalled, but he had this weird sort of revival in the late 90s as a Tuvan throat singer, which is where you can kind of voice multiple tones simultaneously. It's really weird, really compelling.
Oh.
Yeah, there's a documentary about him that's fascinating called Genghis Blues. In any event, I
Hmm.
profiled him. And back
Ah.
when I was in San Francisco, and he died about maybe 10 years ago. He had a really rough go. He was mismanaged by his managers. His apartment caught fire. He's blind. His wife died on him. I think he never kind of got his due really during his lifetime. And I think, when I started doing in the late 90s, I started doing profiles of, artists and writers and
Okay.
people like Paul Pena, and found that I really took to it and really enjoyed it. That was kind of the first signal to me. It's like, oh, okay. I really enjoy getting into understanding something from a group of different perspectives.
Hmm.
The first big profile I did was of Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, and
Nice.
I scored an interview, and I thought, I was so excited. I told my then girlfriend, now wife, I said, I'm doing this interview with Brian Wilson. Isn't this fantastic? I'm going to talk about the Beach Boys. I'm going to go down to Los Angeles. I'm going to go to Bel Air. I'm going to go to his house. So, okay, great. Who else are you talking to? And the idea of like talking to other people to create a full profile of somebody was just so kind of weird and foreign to me that I didn't think about it. But I kind of went to town on that and really enjoyed doing that. And so I think that just kind of cultivated in me this eagerness to try to inhale something from a variety of perspectives. And I think that shows up maybe a little bit in some of the criticism that I do as well. I think there's this urge to try to be as, to be thorough, to be complete, to try to hit something from a variety of angles. So, I think, doing that alt weekly work, and I worry a little bit these days because, I think young writers have a lot of opportunities to get their work out there and to, get experience. But, for me, and, I'm 48, and when I was in my 20s, if you were an aspiring journalist, an aspiring writer, and you didn't have the connections that, Paul Fussel would suggest, that you went to the Ivy League and you can get those, internships at magazines and whatnot, you had to go to the all weeklies. That was where you were going to get that was where you're going to make your mistakes. And that was where you're going to have editors who are going to help you improve. And I think that, people have jury-rigged various apparatuses for online publications for younger writers, but I think it's much more difficult. And luckily with alt weeklies at that time, you didn't have to necessarily screw up in public in quite the same way.
Yes.
When you were a writer, so that was a hugely valuable experience for me.
Yeah, you figure if you did screw up in the alt weekly, there was 40 pages of marijuana ads in the back that made people forget about it, right? So there you go.
Yeah, my good friend Jack, who I work with, liked to talk about the typical SF Weekly reader as Johnny Bong hitting Betty Burrito. That was
so many pages of marijuana ads, so many.
Exactly.
Oh man. In your work, you've talked about a little bit about working with like the nonprofits and the assistants. Is that the term you use? These associations, sorry, of course. And so, writing is by nature a solitary pursuit for the most part. How does that work when you're editing other people's work, when you're proofreading, helping, working together, about kind of not stepping on people's toes, keeping it in the person's own voice, but also giving your feedback and your experience?
Well, I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, I think I spent this past summer working as a writer in residence for a public library out here, and it was fascinating because there was such a wide range of people who needed editorial assistance. There were some people who were retirees and they wanted to kind of dust off their Cold War novel and see what they might be able to do with it. I talked with one writer. She was 16 years old and needed help writing her query letter for her first novel. It's like, wow, you are way more advanced than a lot of people I know at that age. But yeah, I mean, rule one, and I think what's always helpful for me is, you talk about writing being sort of an isolated act, but I kind of feel the conversation is really, really important for that kind of work because, I learned this as an editor when I became an editor at Alt Weeklies, that, getting somebody on the phone is going to be much more efficient and much more fruitful in terms of getting to understand where a writer is coming from and making sure that when you do deliver those edits, that you're not stomping on somebody's voice, that, my job, what I always say is that what I love about that work is making writing 15 to 20% better. What I don't like is running a trauma center where, you kind of have to kind of, start from scratch and, kind of, help build up. And I've had to do that sort of rewriting, and it's, that's not the gratifying part of being an editor. The best part of it is making suggestions that are based on hearing what the writer is telling you and letting them run with it. And, and that's, this is where maybe that Midwestern humility comes in a little bit handy because, it's not my job to claim ownership on somebody else's piece of writing. My job is just to help other writers be as good as they can possibly be.
Right. When you bring up the calling the writer, is that to distinguish from like just sending back and forth tips and advice?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing I learned from this public library experience is that Zoom is a really fruitful way of doing editing. And I think that, a lot of people can be a lot of editors can be very phone averse, and sometimes just, it's just not the way the office works. So, I've been the writer who has just, written a bunch of queries and emailed it off. But,
Sure.
if I ever had the sense that, we're not vibing, or we're not connecting, or there's some sort of misunderstanding, I mean, you have to pick up the phone. There has to be some sort of form of conversation.
What is that like to be that sounds so cool to be a writer in residence with the library? I mean, did you have like a palace, or like, I mean, is there a physical
Wouldn't
residence?
be
No.
pretty to think so. Well, unfortunately, because of COVID, I wasn't actually in a physical space with anybody. But it was really just me kind of doing regular consultations with writers, but also giving a few presentations on a variety of subjects. And I thought that I did a presentation called "Reading Like a Critic," which I thought, like, I don't know if this is going to be meaningful at all to this audience. But the librarian encouraged me to do it, and it actually did get a really nice turnout. I think that it's not that people want to be taught how to read, because that feels a little bit condescending, but
Sure.
I think that people find what critics do sometimes a little bit more fascinating than critics realize. That critics do have this great kind of privileged position of being able to, if you're doing it right, you're trying to process a lot of different kinds of writing and find ways to articulate what it is and how it works. And I think some people find that difficult to do, and appreciate people who do that work.
We're pulling off some incredible transitions here. Transition into talking about your work as a critic. Obviously we're not going to be able to get to all of, I mean, you have so much great work out there. We're not going to be able to talk about every single piece you've ever done, but talk about some generalities and some specifics. When you're a critic, how hard do you have to work to be objective, or is that even desired?
I'm not sure what objective necessarily means. I think one thing I do have to be alert to, and if you've ever read John Updike's Rules for Reviewers, which is kind of a classic of sort of like,
Sure.
5 basic tips for the form. One of the main ones that he puts out there is, review the book that was written, not the book that you wish had been written. Which I think is a little bit wobbly as a piece of advice, because sometimes you do wish that there was something that was out there, and it's perfectly fine to articulate that. But I have to go into every novel is going to teach you how to read it. I think I'm not the first person to say that the term experimental novel is a little bit weird, because all novels in some ways are experiments.
Sure.
So my job is to try to see as clearly as possible what is being attempted. Where the objectivity bit falls off is, where I feel it did or did not succeed in actually doing what it is setting out to do. And of course, if a book seems uncertain of what it is it wanted to do, then that's something I need to talk about as well.
I guess what I mean by objective is that, or I guess maybe talking subjective, that one person's classic is another person's, you put it on the trash heap. Like if it were somewhere, you and 2 other critics read the same piece, would it matter? Would you want it to be that all 3 of you were not that your reviews are like numbers, like 1 through 5, period, done. Would you want to see that you and 2 other respected critics both gave it all gave it a 4, or does that necessarily matter?
No, that's not important to me. And I think it's actually probably, I think it's to the benefit of readers to, have, a variety of, book reviews out there. I mean, I know, just to pick a for instance, I think that, my review of Anna Burns's Milkman was positive. And I know that the New York Times's review was very, very negative. And I think that's, that doesn't mean that I'm right and, Dwight Garner is wrong. That just, means that, there's a variety of, there are different things that we might be impressed by. Anna Burns's kind of take on modernism and applying it to the Irish Troubles, I think was absolutely fascinating and really a pleasure to spend time with it once you kind of got used to what it was doing with language, because it's not easy to get into. But if it just feels sort of foreboding and just too much or a little bit too pretentious in just
Mhm.
its basic concept, then it's not going to hit you, and that's fine. I just don't happen to agree with it.
Is there, when you read as a critic, and you've talked about like the New York Times, you've written criticism reviews for some, the big time papers, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, all the above. Do you read differently? I'm answering my question. Obviously you do. Is it tougher to read for pleasure?
Not if the book is good, not if the book is pleasurable.
Okay.
And doing criticism, it needs to be pleasurable in itself. Otherwise,
Yes. Right.
why do it? Because you really are, you know, in terms of hours spent to dollars earned, you're probably better off working at Target.
Mhm.
It's one of those things that if you have to, at least for me, I enjoy the process of, okay, what is this book trying to do? What is the mechanics of it? If it's not working, why is it not working?
Mhm.
It's, and I do, but I think the other thing that maybe you're suggesting, or at least, one thing that I pull from that, and I've made a decision about this a few years ago, is that I can't constantly be reading books that I'm just reviewing.
Right.
So
Right.
I'm always I carve out space every day to read 15 or 20 pages from something that I
Nice.
am not reviewing. And
Mhm.
what that means is that I'm reading older books, classics. So I think you can get kind of a skewed perspective on literature if you're not
Mhm.
actually reading, if the only thing that you're reading is what is brand new right
Mhm.
now. So, just as a for instance, I mean, at the immediate moment, I'm reading Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which is just a book that has been sitting on my shelf, mocking me unread for years. So I wanted to clear time for it.
Sure. Oh, that's cool. I know it's a little bit of an apples to oranges, not the greatest comparison. It's not an exact analog, but like a lot of restaurant critics will say, well, some will say, I don't do negative reviews. Like kind of
Mhm,
like, what's the point?
mhm,
And so this idea of kind of like bashing a
mhm,
restaurant. I wonder I also wonder, kind of, I guess, about the mechanics of it, about how much choice you have in what you review.
mhm.
But like, if you read a book that's just not good,
Right.
is that going to clearly come out? Is that going to be somewhere you say, hey, I'm not going to do this one?
Mhm,
How does that work? I mean, there is power, like you said, there's power involved, right? You could
right.
change sales, you can change, all that thing, all those type of things. I guess it's the idea of bashing and negative reviews. Is that just, that's the way it is, or how does that
Well, I
work?
mean, I think first of all, I'm not necessarily sure how much sway I have. I really and truly don't. I will occasionally get things popping up in my email or my Twitter feed,
Mhm.
saying that people have bought or not bought based on whatever assessment I have. But I don't feel the burden of when I think about writing a negative review, that's not
Mhm.
the thing.
Okay.
I don't consider myself a kingmaker. That it's like
Sure.
I'm really going to bring somebody down now.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I think in some ways, though, for me, if I do not like a book, I don't have a problem saying that. I think I have maybe a little bit more of a responsibility than I might with a positive review to
Mm.
clearly articulate what
Right.
the problem is. For say like Joyce Carol Oates's most recent novel, as far as I can tell, or Joshua Ferris's most recent novel, both of which I kind of wrote relatively negative reviews about. You know, my feeling is just like I need to kind of nail down what exactly isn't working here. I don't care about what either of them might say on social media or how they might
Mm.
respond, or if at all, or if a book just feels in a lot of ways just kind of almost thoroughly bad, like
Mm.
Matthew McConaughey's memoir. I don't have a problem saying that. I just need to be able to explain as explicitly as possible, you
Mm.
know, here's what went wrong. I mean,
Mm.
here's why this book is not meeting up to what it says it is going to be.
Right. Yeah. So I guess that's maybe what I wasn't clear about. I guess maybe that's what I was thinking more with like objectivity, where it's like you're making like, hey, reason A, B, C, and D. This is why the book didn't work, like in a logical way, versus like you have a bone to pick with the author, or you know what I mean, that
No,
kind of
no, and I
thing.
think I would actually. I mean, I wouldn't just not accept an assignment for
Sure.
somebody. I mean, I'm not an injustice collector. I do not have a list of like writers who I despise and will not experience. But I also know that there are certain writers who I just there are certain writers who I just know I don't necessarily like. There are also certain writers who I don't like, who I sometimes, but who I find absolutely fascinating. I think Lionel
Yes.
Shriver pisses me off routinely and has written some, as objectively bad books, as to the extent that you can use that word, objectively, to call something
Right.
bad. But I always find her interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's maybe, the first responsibility for a critic. You have to just, have that sort of inherent sort of interest.
Mm-hmm.
The first critic I really got into was Roger Ebert. I loved reading him
Yes.
because he was, not necessarily the best stylist, but
Mm-hmm.
he was a writer who, okay, we have a movie about cats and dogs in outer space, let's see how it goes. That he was not inclined to dismiss something just on its premise alone, or if it didn't look, immediately promising. He was willing
Right.
to try to give something a fair shake, and I think that's probably the proper sentiment, because I think if you are going into working as a critic loaded for bear constantly, I mean, maybe there are some people who can pull this off, but it's not my temperament.
Mm-hmm.
My goal going in is always to be somewhat optimistic, have a healthy skepticism, but try to
Mm-hmm.
see what the author is trying to make work.
Nice. Roger Ebert, another great Chicagoan, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh man. I wonder about like the democratization of reviews. I've been practicing that word, democratization.
Hmm.
This idea, there's good reads and there are Amazon reviews, and
Hmm.
where everyone can be a critic in some way, right?
Hmm.
Does that affect you as the professional or not necessarily?
Well, it hasn't affected me professionally yet, knock wood. It's that,
Mm-hmm.
there are still newspaper publications and other publications that care about book reviews and
Mm-hmm.
still run them and still value whatever particular expertise I might
Right.
have or experience
Right.
to bring to it. I mean, I think there's room for all of it. I love glossing Amazon reviews or Goodreads reviews to just
Mm-hmm.
kind of get a sense of, where opinion is kind of shading, or if there are particular things that people are seizing on. There are certain readings of books that, I don't necessarily have as a reflex, but that sometimes, readers on Goodreads might be more attentive to. And that's, I am interested in seeing that and interested in engaging in it.
Mm-hmm.
I think, maybe the best way to put it is that, there's room for all sorts of reviews, just as there
Mm-hmm.
is room for the 800 to 1,000 word daily newspaper
Right.
review that is written for an audience that is not necessarily inclined to read New York Review of Books book criticism,
Mm-hmm.
or might not necessarily be familiar with books. Period. I mean, if I'm writing
Mm-hmm.
for the Washington Post or USA Today, I kind of feel like my mandate. I can't assume that people even know who Jonathan Franzen is.
Mm.
They kind of have to have a little bit of an intro. Like, why do people care about it? Why is this Jonathan Franzen guy, such a big deal to some people? Why are people so mad at him?
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Speaking of Jonathan Franzen, I'm telling you, these transitions. You had a
I'm not trying to actively alley-oop these things to you, I
man.
swear.
I feel like Giannis or something right now with these man. So I mean, even just recently, you've reviewed Colson Whitehead. How about him, by the way? Back-to-back Pulitzer prizes. That's not bad.
Which is
Jeez,
tremendous.
my
Absolutely.
gosh. And going back a few years, and Lauren Groff and Paul Yoon, and so you had a recent one with Jonathan Franzen, and I feel like I'm fairly well versed in him. But also, in the world of like writer Twitter and all of that, he is like controversial. I don't know if
Yes.
controversial is the word, right? But I guess, and so in a recent review, and this is quoting you. Remind me, this one was from the Post,
For,
Washington
for the
Post.
new one, that was USA Today.
You say Today. Quote, Franzen's career-long fixation with writing hefty novels about white-bread nuclear families has a way of making the Twitterati's eyes roll faster than the reels of a slot machine. To critics, he's an anachronism, a chronicler of trite paternalism and a faded middle-class social order. But in prior novels, The Corrections and Freedom, Franzen took an ironic approach to Midwestern suburbia. The unearned self-assurance that resides there isn't, for him, a reason to neglect it. Rather, its hypocrisies are as meaningful literary fodder as a war zone or climate change. So rather than a familiar trope, crosswords is a hefty experiment. How far can you get exploring American ordinariness with a Tolstoyan depth? If I could snap, I would, in appreciation of that writing,
Thank
right?
you.
Unquote. But I mean, as a writing teacher, as an English teacher, there's your thesis statement in there. There's contentions, arguments, the whole deal, like counterclaim, I guess you'd say even. What is so controversial about Jonathan Franzen, and is it something that's just kind of like Much Ado About Nothing?
Well, I think a lot. I think some of it is legitimately about what the media and the book media, book journalism media,
Mm-hmm.
does in terms of which authors it privileges and which ones it
Mm.
doesn't. And that was the whole Franzenfreude thing that Jennifer Weiner and Joni Picoult
Ah,
were engaged in when Freedom came out. So why is Jonathan Franzen the person who gets 3 reviews in the New York Times and 2 profiles, et cetera, et
sure.
cetera? Whereas writers of color or women writers are not afforded that. The idea that there is an idea in the culture's head about what a great American writer is,
Mm-hmm.
and it looks like Jonathan Franzen. So
Right.
perfectly legitimate point.
Sure.
And I think also there is a certain, going back to the Oprah stuff with the corrections, that there's a certain
Uh,
sort of officiousness or kind of awkwardness that sort of radiates off him. That there's a sense that as a writer, he's kind of this throwback to the grand eminence of
right.
great man of letters, that we
Mm-hmm.
don't live in a culture of great man of letters anymore. We don't
Mm-hmm.
live in a culture that is going to identify a one particular great American novel. So even though I think Jonathan Franzen doesn't necessarily write or behave in ways that speak to that, I think a lot of that has been sort of thrust
Thrust
upon
upon
him.
him. Right.
So it becomes complicated. So it can be very hard, if you pay attention to, the cultural chatter around Jonathan Franzen, to sort of separate that reputation with
Mm-hmm.
the work proper. But I think for a lot of readers, who I think, most of his readers probably don't, engage in a lot of these conversations. I think they just find him a, relatively easy to read writer who deals with difficult issues relating to family and society. I mean, he
Right.
is the social novelist that doesn't really exist in any other context anymore. He's
Mm-hmm.
writing the billion-footed beast that
Mm-hmm.
Tom Wolfe wanted everybody to read, but isn't really kind of part of the culture anymore. But if you enjoy that, and it's still a perfectly viable form,
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan Franzen is the master of it, if only because he, all the rest of the competition is either, died off or decided to do something else.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. One of your other recent reviews was for the LA Times, and the article is called "This Refugee Novel Knows It Can't Change the World."
Mhm.
And I want to say that's the
Rabbi Elamadine's The Wrong End of the Telescope.
right. Thank you. The wrong end of the telescope. Um, and your thesis, if you will, is something to the effect of, quote, in recent years, the writer, and I'm sorry, help me with his name,
Rabbi Elamadine.
has visited Syrian refugees in his native Lebanon and the Greek island of Lesbos. By his own admission, in a fine 2017 essay titled Hope and Home, he approached his visits deeply naive. Perhaps he thought before departing from his home in San Francisco for his first trip, the children in the camps would enjoy talking about soccer. One refugee woman flung his questions back in his face. If I talk with you, will anything change? He had only one answer to that. And it's very meta here, where it's like, you are in a way writing about his thesis and you have your own thesis,
Yeah.
right? Still, he wrote, as you continue, if nothing else, I could be a witness. Witnessing and the question of how best to express what you've witnessed is at the heart of his 7th novel, The Wrong End of the Telescope. He's plainly decided that earnest, eat your vegetables social realism is inadequate. It would be no better than the journalism Westerners have diligently ignored since Syria's civil war began a decade ago. But a sense of futility is equally inadequate, and Alamedine has no taste for the magical realist variants or high-flown lyricism attempted by other novelists when writing about refugees.
Mhm.
And I'm sorry, that's, I read more than the little excerpt I wanted to, but there's a lot there about your thesis and what you're trying to get across. My long-winded question here, my long-winded point, my question, that's a book where, you could have some sway, right? And I know you said, you don't feel like you have so much pull or power necessarily. is there a need with a book like that to be kind of like an activist?
I think it's interesting because I think, sometimes I don't want to be the kind of writer or the kind of critic who simply says, read this book, buy it now, you must read it. Because
Uh-huh.
so many readers are so different.
Sure.
So if I say to you, you must read this book, I mean, you can legitimately respond, well, why? What makes you say that I must read it?
Mhm.
So rather than say that the book is something that must be read, I think maybe it makes a little bit more sense that the question is so interesting that
Mhm.
this book, which addresses this question, should be interesting to you as well.
Mm.
I think in a weird way, I think that novel got promoted on themes that kind of felt like would be meaningful to kind of the current cultural moment. I mean, it deals with a transgender doctor, and it is written often addressed to a queer writer who Rabi El Medina is, and is talking about the Syrian civil war, and all those aspects of that book are important and worth paying attention to.
Mhm.
Uh, but this book is also dealing with the question of what fiction can do. So if you just care about novels,
Mm.
um, that is a fascinating book to kind of
Uh-huh.
spend time with, because this is the question. This goes back to Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Mm.
What is the value of a book? Can a book change something? Can it sway policy? Can it change how a society functions? And
Mm.
what I found fascinating about that book is that it is a book that at once sort of throws up its hands at the very question.
Mm.
The issue is so important that you can't ignore it. You can't turn your gaze away from it. That a
Mm.
writer, if you're going to be him and you're going to engage with, refugees from the Syrian civil war, that he has to find a way into it. So, um, you know, it's a tough sell, absolutely. But
Mm.
my job as a critic is not necessarily to sell the book. My job is to engage with the idea in the book, right?
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
again, I don't think of myself as somebody who has sway with sales. So, if you start getting caught up in that, then, you do kind of, critics get so many accusations already to start with that, oh, they're just an arm of the publishing industry. And, they're all just, relentless positivity, and they're all like 50 books to buy now. And, I think there's room for a critic to express real enthusiasm for a book. And I hope that, my interest in that book kind of came through. But to be sort of just the kind of the empty pandering of you
Sure.
must read this. I mean, that's an instinct that I try to fight against a little bit.
Mhm. No, that makes sense. Um, I've never said this word out loud in my life, so help me with the Latin. It's sui generis, sui,
I'm actually I'm not sure. I'm one of those people they
right?
say that if somebody pronounces a word wrong, just forgive them because all they know is from what they've read. I think it's
Yeah.
sui generis. Yeah, I think, but I'm perfectly
So
happy to be corrected.
I may be corrected. This may have been like the thesis, but continuing from that. So Telescope is a peculiar novel, intentionally, a prismatic, sui generis story that's unafraid of humor while addressing a humanitarian crisis, threading a needle between that urge to witness and the recognition that doing so may be pointless.
Right.
I'm not going to top that. That's very well done. I'm not going to make it worse
Well, I
by.
think it was important to mention also that this book is funny.
Uh-huh.
And that's why I talk about sort of the eat the vegetables social realism issue, because I think that we have certain expectations when we come to a book. If I say that, oh, here's a novel about the Syrian refugee crisis,
Hmm.
I think that people automatically have something in their head about,
Right.
oh, okay, I know what this book is going to be like.
Uh-huh.
So and I think what's impressive about this book is that or any novel that I wind up admiring
Hmm.
is that it can have an irreverent take or a different take or an unconventional take on
Hmm.
a subject, not to do so just to kind of like thumb its nose at something, because the Syrian refugee crisis is very, very real in that book, but to recognize that you can address these things in a whole host of different registers.
Sure. Sure. I am a big fan of ending a piece with a question. It's not easy to be done. You did it very well here. But what better way to show why we keep looking, hoping against hope? You wrote a book. You've written two books.
I have written two books, yes.
And there's one to my right shoulder here, and it's called The New Midwest, A Guide to Contemporary Fiction of the Great Lakes, Great Plains, and Rust Belt 2016. And for the record, I believe on Amazon and on Bookshop, it's just called The New Midwest.
Yes.
Right. But it has, has that subtitle, of course. Arguably the thesis of the book is, quote, "This book is an exploration of the mythology through recent fiction that's challenged it." And the that and the it refer to things like the homey, the religious, the self-reliant, and white as possible, these stereotypes of the Midwest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like it was written kind of as a survey, like here are some writers from this area to read, and here's why. But you can tell me better. What was kind of like the genesis for the book, and your aim, your purpose?
Well, I wrote the book because I was asked to write it, which is always a nice thing if you're a book author to be actively asked to write a book. Well, I had been writing for a website called Belt for some time. Before I wrote the book, and the editor there, who expanded into a book imprint, Anne Trubeck, she said, maybe there's room for, kind of the survey of contemporary Midwestern fiction, to kind of build sort of a thesis around it. And I had written an essay for Belt that kind of talked about how so many novels, contemporary novels set in the Midwest, are historical novels. They are not set in the present day. They are, efforts to kind of relitigate the past, to kind of rethink notions of Westernness by, looking at the past history, to kind of suggest that, no, it was more complicated, it was more ethnic, was more, all of the cliches that we sort of attach to Midwesternness, these books are opportunities to undo them. I mean, Marilyn Robinson's, novels are probably, the best obvious example of that. Jonathan Franzen's Crossroads is a tremendous introduction to the genre. If I was doing an update of this book, I would certainly include it, because that's a novel that's set in the early 70s and, is kind of an assault on the sort of orderly, clean, keep your nose clean, religiously rock-ribbed notions that we kind of connect with Midwesternness. I mean, I think that is Jonathan Franzen really trying to reassess that sort of vision of the Midwest.
Do you feel like a literary ambassador of sorts? I mean, was this like, hey, let me show you around, or was this kind of like sticking to that purpose, like, hey, here they are? Like, did you feel like you were like a tour guide?
I didn't, I think to the extent that some people found this book and found it meaningful, I think it's been more meaningful for Midwesterners themselves, just to kind of, have a short book that kind of suggested that, contemporary Midwestern literature is not necessarily of a piece, but that, it is a legitimate genre that a lot of writers want to engage with. So it's harder and harder for me to feel like an ambassador for the Midwest the longer I live in Arizona. But the longer I live in Arizona, I also have a little bit more of a perspective, I think, on what maybe makes the Midwest unique, in terms of its fiction.
Well, shoot, I mean, Arizona and Vegas, everyone's from Chicago anyway, right?
Yeah, I think I do mention this in the book, that the current governor here, Doug Ducey, likes to talk about how Phoenix is Chicago's favorite suburb, but
right.
He says this in a very cynical, exploitative sort of way, because what he wants to say is that you are taxed too high in Chicago, so please pick up sticks, move your company to Arizona, and just kind of leave the Midwest to kind of twist in the wind. So there's a little bit of a barb connected with that.
Totally. Yeah, so I mean, Marilyn Robinson, I can't say that I was too familiar with. So you talk about her, for example, Franzen, of course. I mean, all kinds of writers. Help me out with the Serbian American writer.
Oh yeah, Alexander Hammett.
Right. So it reminded me. I mean, I remember reading his piece in the Best American Short Stories probably like 10 or 15 years ago.
Right.
I'm reminded, like, he's definitely a Chicago writer, a Midwest writer. You really, throw some great names out there. How much of it was kind of like we're not New York, this whole like third city or like flyover country kind of like response?
Yeah, I didn't want to necessarily put the Midwest into opposition with New York literature, or with Western literature, per se. I mean, I think it was just more that here are some themes that I think Midwestern literature is not the Bildungsroman novel of sort of like being young and making it in the big city. It's more kind of, I think there's so much Midwestern literature that is about kind of stalled lives, especially these days. A book like American Rust is very much about that sort of sense of being stuck. And I think conversations about race and place become are a little bit more interesting, maybe a little bit more complicated. I know that the House on Mango Street would be one example of that. I spend one chapter on Leon Forrest's Divine Days just because I wanted to point out that the South Side of Chicago is as much a setting for the African American postmodern experience as any other place. That that the South Side of Chicago had a great postmodernist writer in Leon Forrest, and also Toni Morrison as well, certainly in The Bluest Eye and Song of Solomon. I mean, she mapped out that Ohio River Valley region, that sort of that fuzzy area where the Midwest starts to become the South and the both blur a little bit. So there's certainly a lot to explore there.
Yeah, I really appreciated that that anecdote about, was it Joe Buck?
Yes.
Right, talking about Chicago represents the Lithuanian communities and the Poles, and all of them happen to be European, and like you talked about living in the past. Was it the stockyards he referenced, which is like
exactly
come on, man, like that's decades out of date.
Exactly.
That's been obsolete for a long time.
Right.
You talked about it a bit. Do you feel the Midwest literary scene then is misrepresented, unrepresented, underrepresented?
I think I don't know if I want to necessarily generalize. I mean, I think that we still have a certain notion of there's still this notion that the Midwest is important for literature because the Iowa Writers Workshop is there, but it also seems that so many that there's still this idea that you graduate from the Iowa Writers Workshop and then you go to New York,
right?
And that still New York is still kind of the center of existence and still the most important place in literature. And I wonder about Marilyn Robinson's reputation sometimes, because I think that she has been very well decorated, but I think she's also sort of perceived as sort of a nice United Church of Christ Calvinist lady who wrote Gilead and wrote Housekeeping, but sort of exists as an island unto herself that is not necessarily part of Midwestern literature, which I think is not entirely fair to her, because I think those books can't be written anywhere else. I mean, the way that she writes about race relations and the way that she writes about religion, I mean, I think that they are baked into her particular Iowa.
Yeah, the cool thing is the books has really cool chapters that are pretty explanatory about what's going on. Is this heaven? I'm immediately thinking of Field of Dreams. The latest Migrants, Keep the Midwest Weird, that play on Portland and Austin and all that, and Bad Places, etc. Is the book taught in colleges?
Not to the extent that I'm aware of. I would love to hear if it is. I mean, I know certainly that when the book came out, I did get invitations from the Midwest. I'm going to forget the exact name of it, but like the Midwest Literature Scholar Society, and I was asked to give a presentation, so I riffed on one of the chapters there, and I didn't feel like I did not belong in the room, and I know it's been cited in papers, so there's a lot of I'm grateful for the fact that it seems to have inspired a few conversations about things, but to the extent that if it's been taught in class, it hasn't. I haven't gotten the email from the students saying, "Can you help me with my term paper, which is due in 2 days," which would probably be the best evidence of that, right?
Well, congrats on the book. In that, I really feel like you're like kind of rooting for one team, but not putting down the other teams, right?
Right. Well, exactly. I mean, I think I think for me as a reader, I mean, like just like a sense of place is something that I'm always attracted to. When I lived in Washington D.C., I mean, I gulped down Edward P. Jones and George Pelecanos, and when I moved out to Arizona, I read Song of the Lark and read Dennis Johnson's books that feature Phoenix and Arizona, and Barbara Kingsolver and Alberto Rios and I'm blanking on the other names, but I always try to kind of orient myself, to a place by reading about the writers who have lived here and have experienced it.
David Foster Wallace. You can plead the fifth if you like. I'm thinking of you talk about like place. I'm thinking of his. It's a short piece, but it's the view from Mrs. Robinson or whatever her name is. The view from such and such place. He wrote it right after 9/11, and it's in his small town in Illinois where he grew up, and it's about, like I said, the reaction to 9/11 and kind of. It's just an incredible piece because it ends with basically like, this is a slice of life in our little community, and whoever the terrorists were targeting, it's not women like this,
right?
More or less, right? But it's just, it's a really, and you can argue with the premise, whatever, but it's just a really like slice of life, like very place oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Is David Foster Wallace a Midwest writer? Are you drawn to him, not drawn to him? Are you neutral? Where do you place him?
Well, I'm a great fan of his, and I think his mind was too large and omnivorous to be called specifically a Midwest writer. But there is, if you read The Pale King, there is this tremendous long chapter that is narrated by one of the characters about how he got interested in tax accountancy that is set in Chicago of the 1970s. And, the city just emerges so fully, in his descriptions there that, there is a lot of his Illinois upbringing that does show up there. I think there's, because there is that, if you read his book, that David Lipsky's interviews with him, where he kind of catches, and the movie that was made of it, I forget what the movie was called, but
the end of the tour.
The end of the tour. Mm-hmm. It presents him kind of as kind of mentally kind of split in two. That on one hand, he's sort of the big brained writer who wrote this book about addiction and television and screens, Infinite Jest. But he's also this person who has a sobriety prayer that's kind of sweetly tacked to his wall, and he's going to this church dance at the end of it. And I think what I take of it is not that he's this big brain author who does these sweet Midwestern things. It's more that he's this writer who is in the Midwest who is perfectly capable of having this big expansive capacity for thought, which I think is something that we don't necessarily do with Midwestern writers. We would never say, a John Updike is born to brilliance, right? Being from Massachusetts and going to Harvard and having that experience. You don't necessarily say the same for somebody who grew up in the middle of Illinois and got his MFA in Tucson, Arizona. It's just not the same sort of thing that we apply to somebody in terms of what we think about as a great writer. But I think that he is certainly the case that best proves that a Midwestern writer is somebody who has that expansive mindset.
Yeah, I can't believe I'm forgetting the name of the piece, but one of my favorite essays of his is the one he writes about going to the Illinois State Fair.
Oh yeah, it's supposedly. No, that was the cruise ship.
It's in that essay collection. Right. But the same idea, and I think there's so many levels. Like you said, he's so brilliant. His mind was so expansive that I think he's playing with this. But how much of it he maybe fictionalized or made emphasize certain points. But I feel like it's such a great portrait of small town Illinois life.
Absolutely,
very well. I'd love to hear some of your work.
Okay. Well, what I wanted to read, what I got into the habit to, especially with the Washington Post in the last couple of years, is, wanting to do writing about books that weren't necessarily book reviews per se. And so in April, May of last year, just as sort of the pandemic was, really kind of, getting its claws into all of us, I got interested in all the chatter about quote unquote quarantine reading. And so what I'll do is just read a little bit from the opening of an essay that I wrote for the Post about that concept. We book critics were ready for this. When the COVID-19 pandemic began to enter the American consciousness in late February, an army of reviewers like myself, well, a brigade, okay, we're a platoon, snapped into action. We had deep experience in list making, and now those lists were needed more than ever. What should our quarantine reading be as the stay-at-home orders began to come down? We had the answers: The Stand, The Plague, A Journal of the Plague Year, Love in the Time of Cholera, Station 11. Soon, though, cracks began to appear in this plague-specific strategy. By the end of March, the quarantine reads lists began to include books that writers simply found comfort in, or books that had just come out, or books that had come out a few years ago or centuries ago. Here are some books that are very long to help you get through this, or perhaps you might like to read a book that is very short. Here are books to help you better understand pandemics. There are books to read when the pandemic is the last thing you want to think about. Last week, an email from Harper's Magazine reminded me that it has 169 years worth of articles online, making it, quote, your essential quarantine companion. We'll beat this crisis through robust testing, social distancing, and for some, heavy doses of William Dean Howells. But what we've learned is that any reading will work. Our rapid shift from laser-focused self-improvement to read all the things omnivorousness is a welcome reminder of something that's long been true of modern civilization. All reading is quarantine reading. That is, we use reading not just as a means to educate ourselves or to explore other worlds and such like, but to literally keep our distance from others. And though curling up in a corner with a book seems like an obvious natural act, reading alone and in silence is a relatively recent phenomenon.
All reading is quarantine reading.
Yes.
I like that. I like that.
Well, it's funny. That piece actually kind of came out of me kind of frustratedly writing just that sentence on Facebook, to which my editor said, tell me more. And so that's, how the piece came about.
Oh, I really like that. I like the first part. It really, this idea of like the book is personalized medicine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like this book is medicine for you. This book is medicine for you.
And I think, we have this habit these days, especially of like, of books as healing, which I'm perfectly fine with. And I've also written about this as well. But it's hard to be specifically prescriptive about read this book and it will fix this problem.
Yes.
In my experience, the books that I found comfort in, or that pulled me out of my bad mood or my depression, has always been something that's been a little bit out of left field and is not something that is necessarily specifically tailored,
right.
For my experience. I didn't know that I needed Paul Fussel's class to kind of resolve this sort of weird sort of who am I, where am I kind of feeling that I was, experiencing, until I came across this book, and it just unlocked, certain things that, were finally made a little bit more clear to me.
Mm-hmm. So cool to talk to somebody with such a diverse set of publications, diverse set of skills. I learned about associations. I learned about corrosion. I learned about the way that, that critics work. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk.
It's been such a pleasure, and I wish you great luck in the future.
Thank you so much, Peter. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening to episode 86 with Mark Athitakis. You can now subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star review. You can also ask for it by name using Alexa and find the pod on Stitcher, Spotify, and on Amazon Music. Follow me on Instagram, where I'm at Chills at Will Podcast, or on Twitter, where I'm at Chills at Will PO1. You can watch this and other episodes on YouTube. Watch and subscribe to the Chills at Will Podcast channel. This is a passion project of mine, a DIY operation, and I'd love for your help in promoting what I'm convinced is a unique and spirited look at an often ignored art form. Mark, real quick, would you mind repeating some of your contact info?
Sure. I am on Twitter at MATHITAK, so at Mathatak. Okay. And if you can go to my website, markathitakis.com, which will include email addresses and other contact info.
Excellent. Thank you. The intro song for the Chills at Will podcast is Wind Down instrumental, and the other song played on the episode was Hoops instrumental by Matt Whitehour. Both songs are used through archesaudio.com. For now, thanks again for listening. And I hope, speaking of quarantine, that these quarantine days bring you texts by writers with mad skills, like Mark Athitakis, whose work gives you chills at will.